Now we've just been looking through the test camera here, and this could be a pretty interesting shot to add to the piece as well, but let's go back to the actual render camera to see how this looks from a wider view. And I have been just changing the render camera and the redshift drop here, but shortly we'll look at some of the options in the render view so that you can just quickly switch between cameras and such there without changing the redshift drop. But for now, I'll just stick with this. So I've set that to the wide camera, and let's re-render this. And I'll switch to an earlier frame as well so that we see a little bit more of the bright side of this base here. And things are looking pretty cool now, but there are still a few things I don't like about this. So we have this kind of blotchy color and bump map on the base, this circular section of that terrain here. Those outside edges, that doesn't look very good. So let's go ahead and tweak the shader to address that. You could make a different copy of the environment shader without the noise or the bump map, and then you could apply a different shader entirely to the outside edges. So it's kind of up to you whether you want to drive these render properties with an attribute on the geometry or deal with different shader assignments. I'm going to stick with just the one shader for now, so let's make sure that we have an attribute that we can leverage to base those shader modifications on. So let's go back to the environment and SOPs here, and I'll stop this rendering for a moment and minimize that render view and go to our wide camera. Okay, so we have the terrain here and we have the base there separate. And on the base, we're already adding a mask attribute here because that doesn't have a mask value defined for the base, and we just want that to be a value of 0. So we can also define another attribute that will indicate that this is the side of the terrain. So you could just do it in the same wrangle that we're defining the mask, or just drop in an attribute create. I'll just call this base. I'll leave this as a point attribute. And this could be an integer, I suppose, and we'll set that to a value of 1 and leave the default at 0. And previously I had mentioned that you should watch out when you have this warning about a mix of attributes, attributes being different on either side of this merge. And that's not at all a problem in this case because we're expecting it, and we know that the standard part of the terrain is just going to be defaulted to a value of 0 for that base. So now, if we go back to the shader, go inside rs_env, we have that rs point attribute that we're using to bring in the mask, and we can create another point attribute to bring in that base attribute that we just created. I'll rename this to base, and let's see what attributes we want to change based on that. One of the main ones is going to be the bump map here, and we have a scale input under the texture, so we could connect the base attribute to that, but that would give us a scale of 1 on the outside of this object and 0 on the actual terrain, which is kind of the opposite of what we want. Now, because this base is just a single value, it's not a vector, I'm going to use the outscaler output here. And we can do another remap on that. So do an rs change range, put the outscaler into the change range input, and we've been using a bump map height of 0.3. So on this change range, we'll say that when this base attribute is 0, we want a value of 0.3. When the base attribute is 1, we want a value of 0. So then that remapped attribute, we can wire into the scale input of our bump map here. And if we look back at our render view, actually we lost the wide view. I don't really think that the noise that we applied to break up the color is looking very nice in general. So I'm just going to totally remove that. I'll just bypass this extra noise that's being multiplied in there, connect this to that color constant directly. And let's go back to our render view and re-render this. And now this is looking a lot better now that we've removed the bump from the outside of this terrain, but it's still looking pretty splotchy. And to debug why the side of this is still splotchy, we can disconnect certain parts of our shader to see exactly where that's coming from. So first, I might try to disconnect the bump map here, just to make sure that it's not something weird happening with the bump. And sure enough, when we disconnect the bump, this is still, looking noisy like that. So we'll undo that, and then we can go up to our diffuse color. Now we've disconnected this noise being multiplied in to our color mix here. So just to test if some of this stuff is contributing to that splotchy noise, we can just try connecting our color constant directly to the diffuse color here. And sure enough, that cleans it and those splotchy dark spots go away. So clearly that noisiness is coming from the color mix here, which makes sense because if you look at this change range that's controlling the mix amount in this color mix here, that change range is remapping this to not to a full value of 0 to 1. This is mixing between values of 0.3 and 0.8. So we're always going to have a little bit of this noise being dialed in. It's never totally gone here. Now there are a couple different ways that we could address this. I'm going to use another color mix so that when that base attribute that we've added is equal to a value of 1, then we just get a pure color without any of that extra noise stuff happening. So we'll add in another color mix here. I'll drop that after the previous color mix. So we get the standard shader setup so far as the first input to this new color mix. And for the second input, I'll connect that just to the color constant here. Maybe I'll minimize that render view for a minute just to see it more clearly. And we can just delete this noise and multiplication because we don't need that anymore. And on this new color mix, this is going to be driven by the base attribute that we just added. So we can go down here to where we're bringing in this base attribute, take that out scalar, and use that to drive the mix amount on this color mix here. So essentially, we'll get input 1 on the top of the terrain, and we'll get input 2 on the base. So now going back to our render view, you can see because this was already updating in the background, this has already started rendering this with this latest modification. You can see this is nice and smooth on the sides now. And if we go back to look at our closer test camera, this looks a little bit weird. I don't know why it's updating like that, so let's hit a refresh on this. Possibly because the resolution settings are different on the test camera compared to the render camera. I'm guessing that's why that looked weird. And rendering from our close-up camera just to make sure we didn't mess up anything on this terrain. This all looks good. We don't see the creature anymore just because we're at a different frame. But yeah, this is still pretty noisy. I'm not going to wait for this to clean up, but we verified the bump map still looks nice there. And back in our wide view, it's looking good too.